Thanks everyone for coming along. Those of you joining us on YouTube or joining us through Zoom. So thanks for coming along on what has turned out to be, at least where I am in East Cork, quite a sunny Friday morning. But many thanks as well to Dr. Sarah Thelen for agreeing to be our guest speaker today. Like all of us working in the area of online learning and remote teaching and learning, Sarah's busier now than ever. So we're very grateful to her for having made the time. Sarah, as you'll have seen, I presume in the email I sent out, is an instructional designer just down the road in UCC, and works closely with teaching staff there in terms of integrating technology into their teaching and augmenting teaching and learning with technology. Sarah's also worked on a number of Irish and international e-learning projects, and prior to her time in UCC taught graduate and undergraduate modules and courses at universities in the US and Ireland. So Sarah's presentation today is about thinking about remote teaching and learning. I believe she's going to talk for 20 or 25 minutes, something like that. And after that, we can have questions and comments. Either if you're on Zoom, we can get you on the mic, or you can use the chat area. And if you're in YouTube, obviously you can leave your questions and comments in the comments area, and we'll field them to Sarah. So I think that's, I'll be here, Sarah, obviously lurking if you have any issues, but for now it's over to you.
Great, excellent. Okay, so I should just sort of preface that this whole idea of thinking about remote teaching and learning, I actually joked with some colleagues that I should have called this presentation thinking about remote teaching and learning, because the core of this presentation comes out of some sessions that we delivered to UCC staff over the summer, when we were no one knew exactly what was coming. So it was just kind of trying to prepare people in a very broad sense for a dramatic change in how they would be doing teaching and in the fall. And so I realize that most people watching this have probably already started teaching and have made some of the main decisions they would about their classes, and had some of those decisions made for them in the question of, say, face-to-face or remote. You don't have a choice now. It's been decided. So I'm trying to take that into account and just sort of give you some kind of big picture ideas and some advice and some sort of ways to maybe think about your approach and to think about what you're doing that can be a little more productive and useful, depending on how frustrated you've become over the past few weeks. Because it's a huge change. It's a huge change for everybody. So that can be a lot, and it can be very daunting. But first off, I just want to give some examples of successful remote teaching that I've come across personally. So this is not an exhaustive list. These are categories that kind of I think in terms of, so they're not really official terms. Some are official terms, some aren't. And I'm just going to really quickly go through what is entailed in each type, just to give you maybe some ways to think about, if you don't love the way you're teaching right now, you might be able to pull something from one or two of these and add it to what you're already doing without making a huge change, but maybe, it might help you streamline things or remove something, or maybe add a small bit that you just felt might be missing. Or it'll give you something that you say, Sarah, that's garbage. What I should be doing is this. And sometimes the act of pushing against an idea that doesn't work for you helps you crystallize what it is you want to do. And if I can accomplish that, I'll be very happy as well. So hopefully it's just useful. So just really quickly, the main kind of types of successful remote teaching that I've come across are this sort of the seminar format, which is probably the one that comes the closest to a face-to-face experience while still being conducted remotely and at a distance. And the seminar format, what usually works best in my experience, is the lecturer records an 8 to 10 minute context lecture, sort of framing the readings and tasks that they want the students to conduct. So that's posted to, we use Canvas, posted to Canvas along with links to readings, if they want them to look at documents, if they want them to view videos, any additional material they want them to engage with. and then they create a forum for a discussion. So some courses I work with are fully online master's degrees and have been for years. And those tend to run with synchronous discussions on discussion boards. And with the way the questions are phrased, those boards are very lively and very rich. With the move to sort of everyone going remote at the moment, that doesn't always work. Like that format doesn't suit everyone. So a number of people are still using that asynchronous component, the recorded lectures and the material, and then running live synchronous sessions on Zoom, on Teams, on Google Meet. Even, in this context, those are the ones I would use personally. So that idea, that mix of your online content, framing the reading, and then the core of the work is the student directed reading. It works really well in upper level undergraduate, in master's and postgraduate degrees, because there's a lot of that kind of learning happening already. So you're just sort of giving a little bit of structure and then sending the students off to do things. And then you all work through the ideas. Another format that I've seen a lot of people adopting right now, and I think it's working for people so far. I've heard some success stories and people quite pleased with it, is what I call an active lecture. And that's much more targeting undergraduates and like a really structured taught situation. And it works really well for people who would have used a more sort of discursive lecture style where they have a lecture and then they'll have the students do a small task, whether that's a little pair and share, whether it's a quiz, whether it's polling. And a lot of that moves online quite well. And again, most of this is then delivered asynchronously. So you'd record your lecture, have quizzes, polls, readings, whatever. And you kind of, often what ends up happening is there's sort of lecture, activity, and they kind of stack up until that topic is covered. And one of the great things about online is that you don't have to, when you're teaching with technology and remotely, you don't have to fit that 1 hour time slot necessarily. Like you can let things, you fill that student effort, you still have the equivalent student effort, but the students can kind of do these work at times that suit them. So there's a little more flexibility and fluidity there. And again, these active lectures work really well with, say, a live Q&A or a live component, maybe every couple of weeks, depending on how large the group is. Break them into smaller groups and run a live session every week with just a percentage of the students. There's a lot of fluidity and options there, depending on your teaching style, depending on the students, and so on. Both of these, in a way, once you have that live component, are a flipped classroom approach. And flipped classrooms are something I love, and anyone who's worked in sessions with me in, say, the before times would have heard me talking about flipped classrooms a ton. I think it's a really great way to really maximize that face time with the students. And at its core, a flipped classroom is putting content onto your VLE, and it moves the, what should I call it earlier? I called it the knowledge conveyance. So I'm telling you things, I'm giving you information, I'm giving you context, I'm giving you examples. All the stuff that I tell moves to before the session. And then in the class, whether in the before times face-to-face and now probably in some sort of live synchronous session, that's when you actually work with that information and tease it out and figure it out and play around with it and really internalize a lot of it and kind of work with it that way. And then the last model, which I was hesitant to include at all because it's very hard to do well, but I would be remiss in saying live lectures can work really well. They just require a lot of prep, a lot more prep than just checking your lecture outline, logging into Zoom, or, I mean, we don't use Zoom, logging into Canvas and just delivering. What really works for people who have had success with this live lecture model is to integrate polling, whether through emoji in the chat, whether through something like Poll Everywhere or Mentimeter, and pulling like maybe small breakout rooms, but it's adding a lot of interaction to that online lecture, because I guess that even those of you who are really interested in this topic, something has distracted you and I haven't even been talking for 10 minutes. And that's fine, like that's natural, that's how we all work. And it's just a matter of sort of accommodating and recognizing the realities of people aren't removed from their context and their home environment full of distractions, and they're not in a classroom, they're not removed from all of that. So you need to kind of recognize that and work with it. So again, live lectures can work, but I'd honestly say they're actually the hardest of all of these. And I'm very hesitant to recommend them unless someone's really comfortable with how they're teaching. And I just want to say, like, the main thing that unites all of these different ways of teaching and different formats is the attitude and the mindset of the person constructing the course, the person doing the teaching, the lecturer, the professor, whatever title is given to this person, depending on where you are. Was educated in the States, and I have 8 different titles bouncing around my head all the time. And from having worked with a lot of people, especially, in March and April, and as people started thinking about how they were going to teach, I started sort of these tongue-in-cheek categories of how people approach teaching remotely. And I found there's sort of 4, and I've listed them in the order in which they're effective, in my opinion. So the first group is this through a glass darkly. And that's the attempting to point for point recreate that classroom experience in a remote distance learning environment. And you will have taught, you will have conveyed information, students will learn something, but it's stressful and unpleasant for everyone. It doesn't work, and it generally ends up not taking advantage of the good things about remote and technology enhanced learning, and ends up highlighting all the bad stuff about face-to-face. So you lose the good on both sides going that way. And that's when you're just really just trying to mirror what you would have done before. And the next is what we were pretty much all doing in March and April, which is this idea of just muddling through. Like, we just got through, teaching happened. It may not have been the best that ever was, but it was fine. People learned things, nothing exploded, hopefully. And that's fine, but it's really stressful. And I'm sure for all of you, that switch in mid-March and then into April, it's just stressful because you don't know what's coming and you don't know what's next and you don't have a chance to catch your breath and you can't plan and you just don't know what's going on. And so it works and it's fine, but it's really because we knew, once the summer got along, it was pretty clear that there was going to be some technology happening in the fall. So muddling through we didn't have to do it anymore. I know of people who are still muddling through, and that's for all sorts of reasons, and they're very stressed and it's not fun for anybody. And then the other 2 are both people, or both categories who are teaching remotely, and many of them are resentful. They don't like it. They don't want to do it. They don't appreciate it. They're not interested, but they're doing it. And they may have done a lot of work. They may have done a lot of planning. But what ends up happening with the resentful remote teachers, in my experience, is they put off the planning. They put off prepping, and then they end up scrambling. So they almost end up dreading and then muddling through. So it's a combination of these, just a really unpleasant, stressful environment. And they actually end up often doing more work in the long run because they're constantly trying to fix things. They're trying to clarify things. They're just constantly kind of scrambling to get everything working because they just were so resistant to the idea at first that when it finally becomes an issue that they have to do it, there's not a choice. I mean, this is not how anyone, myself included, would want people teaching online and teaching remotely, because this isn't a good environment and it's frustrating and it doesn't suit everyone. So that kind of comes to the last one, which is this idea of intentional online work and remote teaching. And it's someone who sits down and says, what works for me? How do I approach this? How am I going to do this? What am I going to do? What's the big picture? And it doesn't have to be really complicated, and it doesn't have to be super sophisticated. You have to have a plan. And all of those positive, really good examples that I gave a couple minutes ago, all of those people were very intentional in their teaching. And that's the big thing, is it's just take a few minutes, even when it seems like you don't have them, and really plan for what you're going to do and think about what you're doing. And those of you who are already teaching, I'd say approach it in a sense of, is this working? Take 5 minutes this afternoon, get a cup of coffee, to take 5 minutes and say, do I like how I'm teaching? Is it working for me? Is it working for the students? And if not, there's small things you can do to change. Maybe one of those examples I just gave, something kind of sparked for you. But if nothing else, taking a few minutes and saying, what do I envision for the rest of the term? Where do I want to end up? What's my next step? It just takes some of that pressure off. You're not scrambling. You know where you're headed. You've got your directions. You found your map or whatever. And one of the keys with that and one of the best advantages is that once you have a plan yourself, you can spend some time and energy on being student friendly. And I just want to clarify really quickly that being student friendly means making it as easy as possible for students to access and engage with content. It is not making the content itself simpler. It's not making the subject easier. It's not making the actual academic material less rigorous. You're not dumbing anything down. What you're doing is ensuring that the student can spend as much of their time as possible on the substance of the module, on the substance of what you're teaching, rather than trying to figure out where the lectures are and trying to figure out how things are graded and what's their assignment and what's due when and how do they reach you. And so the big ways to be, like, what being student friendly at its core means is that you're clear in your instructions, you're transparent in your expectations, in your communications, you're consistent. You know, the assignments are always in the same place, lectures are in the same place, you have a consistent structure. It's accessible for people with disabilities and who learn differently. You're responsive and flexible. So this is where that take a moment and say, is this working for me? And if it isn't, change it. Ask the students, use an anonymous form to get feedback from the students and say, look, is the way this course is working, is it working for you? How's it go? And then make changes accordingly. Now, you might not be able to make a lot of changes, but you might be able to clarify things and go from there. And in a previous session, and I can link to the full session, I won't go into all of it, I gave just sort of 5 ways to be student friendly, some really specific steps for being student friendly. And they're to break your content into chunks. So instead of having a 50-minute or an hour-long lecture, go through and break it into 10-minute chunks driven by a topic. So you have a topic, a topic, a topic, a topic, and you're going to have much better throughput of the students actually watching the entire recording when they're shorter chunks and they can fit them into their day. Have consistent and simple slides. These aren't the tidiest slides ever. I see an error coming up in the next one, which is really annoying me, but I've tried to put as little as possible on the slides and still get the point across. Because this session's being recorded, I didn't need to put everything I said on there. It's just some ideas to jog your mind. Use meaningful names for files and recordings. So when you're uploading stuff into the VLE, make it really clear what something is, especially so that when someone downloads it, it's not just a string of letters and numbers. I pull stuff from JSTOR sometimes and it's absolute chaos. And if I don't rename that file immediately, it could get deleted, it could get lost. It's not always clear what something is. So for anything you put in the VLE, try to be really clear. Module code, lecture number, topic, spell it out. Even if it has a longer name, at least then the students can tell what something is. Periodically go through the module and delete outdated information. Just make sure that the only stuff that's available to students is accurate, is current. And then on that, absolute simplest thing you can do is just remove extra menu items from the VLE. Like our version of Canvas always enables conferences, which no one ever uses, always enables collaborations. And there's a few other bits and pieces that are always switched on in the menu by default, but very few people use them. And so if it's in the menu, the students think it's important. And then if there's nothing there, it can be very frustrating for them. So those are just some really small things. Happy to talk more about any one of those as we go through. And then the last thing that I said I would talk about is finding teaching materials. And so that I have a pretty broad definition of what you're looking at and what you're going to do. But the number one thing is start with your pedagogy and practicalities. Don't start with, I'm going to use a TED Talk. Start with, what is this video supposed to accomplish? What is this image accomplishing? What kind of tech do my students have? Is it going to be an image on a slide? Am I actually going to analyze it? Is it core to my teaching? Because those kind of things determine, like, if you're using an image, in this case, like if you're just using it as a graphic on a slide, it doesn't need to be high quality. But if you use really high quality, it then makes your file size very big, which can make streaming clunky, which can make downloading clunky, and it's all for something that's purely decorative. So, but at the same time, if I was going to be talking about how people use gradients to convey space and time and angles and light, you would want a really detailed image because you're really engaging with it and it's actually a teaching material rather than a supplement. So think about that when you're looking for these materials, like what role are they playing and how high quality do they need to be? Copyright, there's a huge amount out there. The IUA EDTL project did a session on copyright and OERs over the summer. That's quite good. Darius Whelan from UCC Law talked a lot about copyright in education, and I am not going to attempt to copy. I'm not going to attempt to repeat what he said, but I will pass along a link to the recorded presentation because it's a really good overview of what an academic needs to keep in mind when teaching and what copyright considerations there are. But at the basic, try to use public domain stuff. Public domain is just free and open for everyone, and that's the safest stuff to use. Some sources for that, and there should be a heading here, so I apologize for that. But some of my favorite sources for teaching materials broadly defined is the Internet Archive. I'm a historian by training, and so the Internet Archive is great for ephemeral film, documentary shorts, documents, books, newsreel footage. There's tons of stuff in there, and it's fascinating, some of the stuff that's in there. You can get really good. I really love lecturing on the early Cold War in the US and civil defense, and there's some amazing stuff in there. And everything in the Internet Archive is public domain and available. And it's a very broad, I mean, it's way beyond history. There's so much stuff there. Flat Icon is where I got all the images in this presentation, and I really like them. They're really simple, they're clean, and you can find something that will have a look and feel that works for just about anything. And you can tweak them slightly, which is handy. Wikimedia Commons, another great place for images that are public domain or Creative Commons released. And it's a really great way. If you start in something that's public domain, everything you find is free to use versus doing a Google image search or a Bing image search. And odds are the first 10, 15 hits are usually copyrighted. So you just want to be careful of that. And then I'm told you're doing a session, there's a session in the next week or two on open educational resources. So I won't go into that too much, but basically those are materials that someone else has already made that they can cover almost anything. They can be videos, they can be slide decks, they can be lecture packs, they can be readings, they can be all these things. And that's just a case of you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's entirely possible that someone made a package of resources on a topic you're teaching. So it's worth looking for that before you start building your own. And then you can tweak them. Most of those are released under a share and share alike Creative Commons license that lets you make changes. So they're worth looking into because there's some really, really creative, thoughtful stuff happening out there. So that's a whirlwind through a few of the sessions I've done and just some kind of big picture things to consider. And I guess what I'd encourage you all to do, again, maybe this afternoon if you have time, on Monday morning before things get really crazy, just to take a few minutes and first off, evaluate and revise your communications policy. If you don't have a communications policy, please, please, please come up with one. That's all you're saying in a communications policy is please contact me via email or whatever. You're telling the students how to contact you and when they can expect a response. And my personal one when I'm teaching is please contact me via email. I will endeavor to reply within 24 hours, Monday to Friday, Irish working time, or something along those lines. The phrasing changes every time. But the gist of that is that way a student who emails me at 10 p.m. on Friday knows they aren't going to hear from me until sometime on Monday at the earliest. And so then by being transparent, and I post that to Canvas, I make that very obvious to the students what the policy is and do a policy that works for you. I've worked with people who say, I check emails on Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m. I mean, not the policy I would have, but do something that you can stick with and then set up your notifications and use Do Not Disturb on your phone to turn those things off, because the hardest thing about teaching remotely is drawing that line between teaching you and living you. And you need that line, you need that, or it's just gonna fill up your time, because students will email when a question occurs to them. But you don't have to answer when they immediately, and just turn off your notifications, because it's really hard once you see a notification not to check it, and then it's in the back of your mind, and all of a sudden you spend Saturday doing all your work. And you probably are working on Saturday, but you probably you need some structure, and you just need a break from the constant barrage of questions and concerns, and you need some control over how things are. And if you're clear with the students, it's completely fine. Next thing on there, and I'm aware that I've gone over a little bit, so I'm going to zoom through these here. But this idea of triaging your module. So if something's not working, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling swamped, if you're feeling like you're burning out, look at your module and say, what can I get rid of? Do I love this thing? Do the students need it? Do the students love it? If the answer to if the answer to any of those is no, and if the answer to all of those is no, you can just tell the students, like, look, we've removed this element, it wasn't working. And that's fine, because everyone knows this is an experiment. So look at your module and say, what's the most important thing? That's what my time goes to. Some of these things are nice to have, but maybe I can't maintain that level of involvement. Then also, when you're sort of saying, look, if something's not working for me, consider your strengths. You know, what are you good at? If you are terrible at leading in-class discussion when everyone's in the room, maybe you don't want to lead discussion in Zoom, because it's not going to get any easier. Maybe you want to lead a discussion on a discussion board where you can have a little bit more space to really think about what you're going to say and what you're going to do. I use that example because I'm not very good at leading discussion in a room. So I would definitely lean towards discussion board with the odd, less, very, very informal video interaction, just to kind of add variety. But it's just a matter of what works for you, and what, if you do something you're good at, it'll be easier and more enjoyable, and the students will pick up on the lack of the lower stress levels attached to it. And then the last thing is this, going back to that idea of chunking, is rethink the unit of teaching. Teaching doesn't have to equal 1 hour of lecture or 2 hours of lecture. Teaching can equal a bunch of very small things. And once you kind of decouple the idea of teaching being an hour-long lecture, you can really take advantage of the flexibility that remote and technology enhanced learning really bring you. So, and on that, I will end. And if we have questions, I am happy to answer however is best. And I can stop sharing my screen if that's better for yourselves. I don't care.
Well, thank you so much for that, Sarah, for such a succinct but wide-ranging and such a practical but also kind of theoretically based presentation. Some really great stuff there in terms of the various different categories of remote teaching, the different approaches and mindsets, the importance of being student-friendly and ways in which to be student-friendly. I think we talk a lot about being student-centered, but you know, maybe it's important that we maybe inflect it slightly differently for the remote teaching context in the way that you have done there. And those final practical steps are really important as well. Communication came out as being such a really important thing for staff and students alike in a recent survey that we did. I think, as I said to you in advance, there's a huge amount in common between the kinds of things you've been saying and what we've been trying to get out there with our various different guidelines for remote teaching and learning. So look, we had 10 people joining us through Zoom, and another 35 or 36 on YouTube, which isn't bad for a sunny Friday morning.
I've definitely given sessions to just my colleagues. So
say again, sorry?
I said I've definitely given sessions to just my colleagues. So
well, we've done better than that.
Yeah, exactly.
So hopefully we have some engagement. I don't know if there's any questions, if anybody wants to come in with anything. I think there was one comment on YouTube. Dara or Rogine, anything you have spotted or would like to field, or anyone else joining us either on Zoom or YouTube who wants to put in a question on Zoom? Obviously, you can take to the mic as well as using chat. On YouTube, you're limited to the comments feature, but we can field your question. We can read out your question. Well, I can potentially get the ball rolling if there isn't anything yet. I suppose while you were talking about being student friendly, it was occurring to me that there's a lot in common between some of the advice you were offering and the whole world of kind of user experience and usability. So think maybe similar similar tips kind of apply. So there might be some profit or some benefit in looking at some of that literature as well. And sometimes it's just very basic stuff like staying consistent. Consistency is obviously really key to good user experience, and that whole adage of just doing less with more, avoid clutter, avoid overly elaborate kind of hierarchies and things like that, you know.
That's the big thing a lot. Like one of the things I say to people a lot, and they're like, what's the best thing for this? I'm like, the best tool is the one you'll use. So don't try and add a million bells and whistles if they intimidate and overwhelm you. Like what students want is something that's going to work. And, you know, sure, they're going to appreciate, you know, using Mentimeter with a Padlet, with a video that has fade-ins and voiceover, and, you know, like they're going to like those slick production values. They, you know, they'll appreciate it. But if you do that and it crashes every third time, they're not gonna like, you're not getting anything out of it. It, you know, my thing all summer and especially lately has been as few moving parts as possible. So, you know, do as little live as possible. Like when you're doing something live, have it just be one targeted thing, and have as much done outside of the live session, because it's a lot easier to fix when the tech breaks when you're recording than when it breaks live. Or, you know, like I have 2 cats, and if one of them decides to wander in, and one of them is very noisy when she wants fed and she doesn't shut up ever. And if she just decides to stand next to my desk and demand food during a live session, there's not a whole lot I can do. But if I'm recording, I can pause the recording, lock the room, and hope for the best. And, you know, it's in that's a very flippant example, but doing that where you just make sure you're using something that you know how to work, that it's stable, that it's reliable, that makes a huge, huge difference. And then I've got, I of course closed my presentation, so I'm gonna reopen it here. And I have a few examples from the larger presentation on being student friendly that I can show you if you want to see those.
There's another maybe related question just in there, actually, from Finbar Sheehan, wondering, well, relating to your presentation at least, about recommendations for engaging undergraduates using that flipped classroom approach.
Yeah. Okay, so
you were kind of describing that flipped classroom approach earlier as being about kind of like changing that kind of balance between what we used to regard as homework and what that we used to regard as I don't know, your standard classroom time or your direct instruction piece.
Yeah, and so on that, I mean, for what usually this comes up in the context in the past for me in terms of saying, oh, you know, one of the great things about teaching, you know, using, you know, in these cases, these were fully online master's programs, so it's a completely different beast than what we're doing. But I'm like, you know, bringing reluctant people on board, I'm like, one of the great things is that instead of paraphrasing someone's argument, you can just point the students to the reading itself, and they can read the argument and read the scholar's thing themselves. And the response is always, oh, the students don't do the reading. And my response is always, do you discuss the reading in class? And they go, no. So if you aren't engaging, and this is a factor of like this is how lectures work, and it's not faulting how anyone's teaching in the past. It's just to point out that if the student doesn't need to do the reading, if they can get through the class and not do the reading, they're not going to do the reading. So what has to happen is, and the advantage of the flipped classroom, and it almost 100% will result in a couple, at least one incredibly awkward session where you bring the students in and you say, now, before you come in on Tuesday, I need you to have watched the lecture and read this article. Odds are they won't have, because in their entire career, they didn't need to. So they're going to turn up and you're going to say, okay, well, I'll use something from my own work. You know, what was Fred Logeval's argument? And they will stare at you like this. Or more likely, they'll turn off their camera and pretend not to know. And and you have to sort of, you just sort of have to accept that this is happening. It's not a failure of the method. It's just that they don't know how to do this yet. And so then you can take pity on them and say, okay, well, either you can say, take a few minutes now and skim his introduction to see what he says. But once they realize that they do, like that the material they do before class gets engaged with in class, in my experience, they will start to read it and engage it there. So that's the most basic, is to structure your face-to-face, whether it's in person or via some sort of internet enabled who's you what's it, structure your face-to-face session such that it draws explicitly and directly on that pre-session work. And, you know, don't give up right away. Don't say, oh, they didn't do any reading last time, so the first 10 minutes of today, I'm going to summarize the reading. They're never going to do the reading if you do that. You know, and if you think to yourself, if you know, you wouldn't either. So that's the first thing, is you structure your class so that it explicitly draws on what you said was required. And then in the session, if they're quiet, I've had really good luck, and I know of people who have had good luck with setting up, say, a Padlet. I don't know if Padlet's cleared for yourselves to use. Have you ever used Padlet?
Yeah, we've used Padlet. I suppose we're not in the business of stopping anyone from using anything.
Okay, so we have
it's not explicitly a thing that we're,
yeah, there's kind of a
supporting.
There's a semi-official policy at UCC that if it's not been, there's stuff with student data and clearing and external hosting. So I'm always wary of recommending, but Padlet's great because Padlet is basically like an online notice board that you can set up that students can submit anonymously. And that takes a huge amount of the burden, because a lot, like, they don't want to look wrong. They don't want to be wrong publicly. They don't want to look stupid. And if you create a Padlet, or even, you know, I use Google Forms sometimes to ask a question. So I teach US history, and I teach a US history survey. And one of the questions, the last class, is a sort of a summary of what we've covered. And I really want them to sort of see how the past pulls into now. And now is a very interesting time in the United States. And so what I always ask, and I might ask it next term, I teach in the spring, but what I've asked for the past 4 years is I've done it as a Padlet and I've done it as a Google form, and they both work. But I say, you know, why was Trump elected? Think about the class, think about what we've talked about, and why was Trump elected? Everybody has an opinion about that. And there's a million reasons. And every discipline, I think, has those kind of really open-ended questions that you can't really be wrong with. And so if you set up a Padlet and sort of open with that, it can create a space where everyone can participate. And then you've sort of set up this precedent of engagement and participation that then makes it easier as you get more substantive and more structured. So I used to do in the States, I would teach a class, it's less of an issue over here, but there's a big debate in the States over mascots and sports teams. There's a lot of incredibly racist mascots for sports teams in the United States. And everyone has, even if you don't care about sports, everyone has an opinion over whether, you know, the Cleveland baseball team, who are called the Indians, should be called that. And there's a lot of that. Like, it's a very niche thing and it works much better in the US. I wouldn't use it here, but there's always some sort of pop culture, low stakes question. And I'd start with that and start with something like that. So you could do an anonymous survey that, if you, depending on how you ask the question, Google Forms can display a lot of graphs and charts as people answer. Stuff like Mentimeter, any of those polling tools, you can get a really quick anonymous result. And that can work really well to kind of pull students in. And then I think once they see that you take those answers seriously, they'll be braver the next time. And it's a matter of training, because it's a completely new way for them to learn. And that's something that we can lose sight of, because you can say, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing. This is all new. The students expect so much. They're going to expect perfection. It's like, they don't know what they're doing either. Like, this is brand new to them, to most of them. So like, this is new for everybody, and that makes it really hard. So it's really a question of scaffolding. So I always start really small and simple. One of the online programs I supported, it's a master's degree, he asked the exact same discussion question every single week, and it worked amazingly. And I was very skeptical. And his discussion question for every week of the class was, what was your favorite reading this week and why? And some of those students wrote 1,000 words, 1,500 words. They had so much to say. And the thing is, you can't be wrong about why I liked something. And it worked spectacularly. I was
Yeah,
very
it's that
skeptical.
low stakes kind of idea again.
You
So
know, and it's just,
Finbar actually got back and he's saying his experience was that only a very small percentage of students do the reading in advance. But he agrees, yeah, he's just going to have to get over that first awkward lecture, going back
yeah.
to come back to what you said earlier.
Like
So
I've
great.
definitely been known to, again, teaching in the States, I taught a lot of gen ed courses, which we don't have here, but it would be like people majoring in physics were required to take a couple history courses to graduate. They were not interested at all. So you have to sort of train them up in getting interested and getting engaged. And these sort of small stakes questions worked really well. Sometimes I would have them submit a question in advance. So everyone had to submit a question to the discussion board before the class. And then I would use those questions to seed the discussion so that you knew at least one person had thought about it before you lead the discussion. But those kind of things work. But yeah, I mean, sometimes I would pause and give the students 10, 15 minutes to read. I'd outright ask them, I'd say, how many of you have done the reading? And they'd say 2 out of 20 had. And I'd say, okay, take 15 minutes, sit down and skim it, and then come out of this. We're going to talk about it. Like, you aren't getting out early. I will sit here and stare at you, and it's going to be awkward for everybody. So, you know, we'll do this. And after that, they did get better. But it's just sort of, you have to commit to an awkward period, especially if you're doing kind of a live, if you're doing it spoken, you have to give way more time than you think to let them think through your question, process your question, think about the reading, and then process and articulate their answer, which takes, it can take
you gotta
minutes.
scaffold that a bit for them as well, I guess.
Yeah, and it's really easy for us leading a discussion to say, any questions? No, okay, and we go on, because it's really awkward, but you just need to give them time. And that's where, say, posing your first question online and saying, you know, we're going to start with this question on Thursday, gives them time to think about it, or doing the typed out discussion can work really well in that way too.
Yeah, that's, I suppose you've covered a lot of it there, but there was another question. Do you have any thoughts on encouraging students to participate more in lectures? Just to turn that into a different question, maybe, there's quite a big use of Zoom for lectures. In fact, I suspect maybe a lot of our timetabled classes, for better or for worse, have been replaced with Zoom sessions. There is a danger, as I've experienced, that we turn our Zoom classes into broadcasts, you know what I mean? So direct instruction. So separate maybe to some of the stuff you're saying about flipped classroom, what are ways to encourage the students, I suppose, to participate and have social presence and have some kind of sense, I don't know, of being part of a community, maybe while the class is going on, and ideally after it's ceased as well, you know, that this becomes something that carries them through and becomes I don't know, some kind of mutual support thing that they can that they can rely on. I mean, do you have any tips in terms of icebreakers or views in terms of putting students into breakout rooms or getting them to use their webcams? That's a big debate at the moment.
Yeah, no,
should we ask students to use their webcams or not?
I mean, what I do on the webcam issue is the advice I've been giving people is to say, look, it's, you know, don't feel like you have to. It'd be really great for me if anyone who feels comfortable turning on their webcam did, because it's just a lot easier for me to be able to see some faces. But I realize, you know, your Wi-Fi might not be up for it, so don't feel like you have to. And I like to build that Wi-Fi excuse in, because then someone who doesn't feel comfortable for other reasons, it's sort of you can kind of, it gives them a reason. They don't feel like they have to justify it. You can say, look, if you don't want to, don't feel like you have to. I would love it if you did. But, and it is, because it is really awkward sort of speaking to a crowd. One of my colleagues in chemistry here has had really good luck with, he'll ask a question in the chat and just ask students to reply with emoji. So like the smiley face for yes, the frowny face for no. And you get some really just quick things there. And that's a low stakes way. You can, I don't know if Zoom has this option, but I know in Teams, you can really quickly add a poll. Breakout rooms are brilliant for that. I'm told anecdotally the breakout rooms in Zoom are excellent, and creating a space for a smaller group of students to work together is really, really good. And I mean, I guess I would come back, and this is just a function of, you know, my own biases, but I'd say, does it all have to be live? You know, could you record even a part of that lecture and create some space in the class time, or even just create, so that make that live space a more fluid time? Because I find it really hard to switch gears from I'm listening, I'm listening, I'm listening, I'm talking, I'm talking, I'm talking. And I imagine it's similar for students. And, you know, for some people, their pedagogy require, you know, you need that switching gears. But in this climate, I'd say, you know, if something can be recorded, I'd really urge you to seriously consider recording it. At least at UCC, you know, you can delete the recordings, you can edit the recordings, you can do all sorts of things with them. But then it means that that live face-to-face session can be more fluid, and you don't feel that pressure to cover these 10 points, and you can kind of let things happen, and you can let people joke. I've come across where someone interrupted their session at one point, their cat wandered in and they said, "Oh, look, here's my cat." And then all the other cat people in the session, like 80% of the people in the session were like, "Here's my cat." And they all kind of did that. And I think there's a lot to be said for being a person in these sessions. You know, I actually have that as a piece of advice in what is it? It's presentation on creating engagement. And one of the things is just be a person, be yourself. You don't have to be super professional on top of everything all the time. Create sort of an office hours space, maybe do a scavenger hunt, or, you know, do something less formal to sort of create a different mood and temperament there. But I think polling is really the easiest way to kind of get students to kind of click on.
So polling's great, chat is great, that emoji idea is great.
I think it's
the
brilliant.
breakout rooms, I think, can be really powerful, you know, so you send people off to have a chat about something, and then maybe there's a plenary session, or there's some way in which they
and
back to you or
one
a
thing
larger group.
I've come across is people are going to do breakout rooms and then have the students sort of put their answer to the question in a shared Google Doc.
Pretty good, yeah.
So that you still have some accountability in the breakout rooms, but that they don't have to come back and speak necessarily, but the ideas are getting exchanged. So
excellent. And you touched on recording there, which is an issue for some people. Does I don't know, the fact of recording work against, in a way, your advice to be a person, to be kind of loose and fun, because you're concerned about things, you know, being on the record, or
yeah,
know, I mean, being persistent, as we often hear about digital media. It's always out there. I mean, I do hear people pausing maybe before, as in pausing the recording, sorry, before they have discussions, or maybe less formal activities. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, well, so my recording was very much a record in advance. So record separate from a live session,
Gotcha.
synchronous session. So at UCC, everything is being recorded, is supposed to be recorded, except for exceptions with like personal data and sensitive information.
Okay, so just to clarify for people, that would be using your lecture capture system.
Not though, yeah, or Teams. So the expectation is that all teaching is being recorded this year because of all of everything. The idea is, like, you don't want to disadvantage a student whose internet goes out or who's unwell, or, you know. And so the recording I recommend is much more a sort of along the lines of, like, if you go and watch those Talk Digi sessions, I think they're much clearer in some ways. Like, this was very targeted, but it pulled from 3 sessions. And if you, like, pre-recording lets me make my point and speak to sort of an abstract audience, and it makes it much more uniform, the delivery. So delivering, like, if someone watches this recording of the presentation, even the slides, when it was just me over slides, you're going to get a different feel than the Talk Digi recordings. And it's a really subtle thing, because speaking to an audience, even when you can't really see them, there's a different tone. There's a much more present, current moment sort of feel to it. And that can be very off-putting to someone who's not in that moment, not in that audience. So that's one of my frustrations with the hybrid model, when trying to advise people on how to do that, where you're teaching to a percentage of your students in the room and a bunch of them online, because speaking to an online audience is very different than speaking to a face-to-face audience. Speaking to an audience here where I can see you is very different than speaking to an audience that I know will watch at some point. And I really recommend pre-recording as much as possible, because then everybody gets that same experience. And it works really well that way. And for me, I get really, like, if I have a lecture I want to get through and something goes wrong, I'm going to be so rattled. I like, if my tech had collapsed during my actual presentation, I'd be really stressed about it. And I wouldn't be loose, and I wouldn't be fun, and I wouldn't be able to make that joke about the cats or whatever. But now if my tech goes out, it'd be fine, because I'm not under pressure to present anything. So it just removes a layer of pressure, and you can be more relaxed in those live sessions. And if you're relaxed in the session, the students will pick up on that. You know, so if you're really grumpy and resent the fact that you're teaching this way, the students will pick up on that. I'm not faulting the fact that you're grumpy. Like, I'm grumpy a lot of the time about all of this. This is not how I think any teaching should be happening, but we don't have a choice. Like, this isn't some evil plot by people who think technology is great. Like this, we don't have a choice. We need to stay safe. And you need to find, if you're really frustrated by all of this, you need to find a way of teaching that you can deal with and be okay with, because the more okay and relaxed you are about your teaching, the more comfortable the students will be, and the less tense the environment will be, and the more likely they'll be to speak up. And that's just sort of a really base level thing. So it's like, figure out what works for you and what makes you comfortable, and that will kind of translate to engagement.
Okay, that's a pretty good note to end on there. Some really interesting stuff I could get into on around pre-recording things and synchronous versus asynchronous, but I think we're nearing the hour, and we promised people a 40-minute session. So thank you so much again, Sarah.
Someone asked about cameras, and I think we covered that.
Funnily enough, we did. Yeah, they asked about cameras just as I was saying it, or just as I was about to say it. So I think that we covered. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think ethically we can't require it.
Yeah,
it's a huge invasion of privacy. Selfishly, I would love for everyone to have their camera on, because it's way easier to talk when you can see people, but ethically we can't.
Even if it was just for the first few minutes, I think, just to kind of establish that sense of presence.
I gave that advice. I gave to a colleague who was teaching a seminar the other night, and he used it, and he said like 3 of the 15 students did, and he said it made such a difference just to have a couple engaging.
But you know, sometimes over time, you know, you'll see those numbers improving. I mean, like yourselves, we've been doing online programs for years now, and we've been using Zoom for nearly 4 years now, and often you'll find people maybe quite reluctant in the beginning to turn on webcams or use the microphone, and then gradually, as they come to understand maybe the importance of establishing presence, or they come to know their classmates through other means, maybe asynchronous discussion lists and so forth, they become more willing to share. And it's a bit like what you were saying earlier about not having to appear perfect, you know.
Yeah, and
to be on the webcam and look a bit disheveled or whatever, or have your cat walking across the keyboard, you know, because there's then the sense these people are my friends, you know, I'm sharing my life with them a little bit.
Exactly. And I think it's something where, you know, it's, once we're out of school, it's easy to forget what it felt like being on the spot in a classroom is. And so I always think it's funny when I used to go to lectures on campus, and you watch the people who complain about the students sitting in the back playing on their phones, and you watch them file into the lecture, they go straight to the back of the room and they get their phones out. Like, that's what they do in these face-to-face lectures themselves. And it's a very human state. Like, we don't want to be on the spot. We don't want to be on show. And the more lower stakes you make that, the more likely they are to buy in. And some other just small things that I remembered: encourage all the students to put a profile photo on your VLE, on their account for the VLE, so that when they're discussing, you actually see a face in the discussion boards. It's a tiny thing, but it actually makes a huge difference. And then I always recommend that people create a discussion forum, like a thread for just general stuff. So you just create a thread for the students. You make it really clear to them that you don't monitor that thread, that you pop in and out, but you're like, that's not where to ask you questions. And then that's a space for students to be like, I saw this great video related to something, or, you know, this, that, the other thing. And that can help the actual discussions stay more on track if they have this other forum. A lot of school programs call it a coffee shop, a general forum. One calls it the well, for like the central well in a village, you know, like these sort of informal spaces that it's more student controlled. And those work really well to really help the students sort of get a sense of who and what they are. And as you can tell by the light on me, the sun's coming out even brighter.
Good stuff. So listen, I really will bring things to an end now. I think, thank you so much for your time, Sarah. I know, like the rest of us in the area, you're extremely busy. It is so encouraging to hear that you guys in UCC are engaging with the same issues and to a large degree coming to similar conclusions. They can't in all cases be called conclusions, but similar discussions at least in a way. So let's keep up the contact. And
yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to answer any questions people might have along the way. I'm quite easy to find. I'm pretty sure I'm the only Thelen in Ireland. So I'm quite easy to find if you have questions along the way. So
well, great. Well, thanks again. Mind yourself, and I'll
perfect. Take care.
subsequently. Bye, everyone. Thank you, and have a nice weekend.